Hello everyone, today we talk about the Austrian Habsburgic economy before the 30 Years' War. As you know, Europe during these decades was going under a so-called price crisis that was reflected at different political and social levels, partly triggering the same 30 Years' War, shifting the balance of power, or at least, altering it for sure and disturbing the system in continental Europe as well. Not materialistic history, because of course spirit and matter are the reflection of one another traditionally, with the radical difference that of course without spirit, matter goes nowhere by itself. So when we talk about history of economics, broadly, generally, in this video, we're mostly looking at through the material, financially, economic side of the story, what was happening politically, militarily, socially in these communities. We have already introduced the Habsburgic domains leading up in the generations leading up to the 30 Years' War. We have observed how this crisis essentially fits a context of definitely severe challenge for the Habsburgic monarchy, considering its relatively precarious position in Central Europe. When I say precarious here, I don't mean that, of course, the Habsburgs were, particularly precarious polity. Rather, the fact that even though each of the various international contendants were in pretty dire straits for different reasons at all times, as it's normal, especially for pre-industrial systems and more. Central Europe, Mitteleuropa, was undergoing more than the rest of the continent, at least compared to the western part, like an important descent, so at least at this state building, financial availability, territorial stability sense. This extends further east, etc. And again, this is a problem for everyone, even for the most advanced France and Spain. We will talk about them in this context leading up to the 30 Years' War, exactly for this reason. At a point, there are new competitors, there are old enemies, and everyone is trying to essentially erode each other's power. All right. And the Habsburgs are central, of course, not just in this geographical sense, but in a broader historical one, in maintaining, in many ways, the balance, pursuing policies that would not essentially ignite particular crises at the very, labile frontiers that this empire had, even beyond the Holy Roman Empire, as we have often seen. Such issues were further complicated by additional difficulties that, as we discussed today, were inherent in European society at the dawn of the 17th century. I cannot mark one point specifically in time, but again, in the decades leading up to the major conflagration in the old world, you have to pose yourself some question about the economical side. There is a sense, at least historiographically, and not from such a long time, regarding this period as the one of general crisis. Right? This is the crisis of the 17th century. It's debatable to which extent we can talk of this, but we will articulate it today. Surely the 16th century had been a moment of major crisis in many ways. But given we're talking from an economical standpoint, there are some particular aspects of this factor that deserve attention. The 16th century, in fact, as a legacy, was still not over. in terms of the changes and challenges it had procured. The economy had undergone an irrevocable transformation due chiefly to this dramatic expansion of trade. In spite of the crisis, as it often happens, the system was expanding dramatically. This was true since, say, the Renaissance. But so expansive was the inflation as well. That's why we talk about this sort of price crisis, some call it price revolution, whatever. I don't like the term revolution, if not, say, for the sort of inescapably applied things like, I don't know, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and so on. But as you know, in this particular period in history, the early modern era, the expansion of colonial dominions, there had been a massive inflation triggered by the influx of silver imports into Europe from the New World. Right, as you know, I recently started also a series on the conquistadores and how their epopee alone was motivated largely by the discovery of the precious metals. One can argue very simplistically that up to this point in history, broadly meant, Europe had primarily operated within a barter and subsistence-based agrarian economy. This is true for any pre-industrial system. We're not in industrial times yet, that in a way these preconditions will allow for that actually to kick in the 18th century. So just here we're talking the end of the 16th. So it is more than a century before. And as you know, Central Europe would not historically be a dramatically industrialized country until for Germany, the 19th century, for the rest, essentially the 20th, aside from certain islands, but that's not what we will be talking about here. The historical, traditional landscape of Mitteleuropa and of the old world up to this point had been dominated chiefly by land-owning noblemen, and it relied on a peasant labor force. What is important in sort of entering this context is, of course, realizing that while we are living in an industrial age, and it's completely normal to consider certain dimension of society and economics in even this sort of diachronic perspective, the world up to that point had been fundamentally only about this previous system, right? There was nothing properly in the mental cadres that was going beyond this world and all the cultural fabric that was entailed by such system. However, exactly from the Renaissance on, the discovery of the New World, the establishment, in fact, of a colonial enterprise in a Europe that was already heavily interconnected, right? This system began to change gradually, of course, towards a more monetary and market-oriented economy, right? The peak of mercantilism, you will know it's, I don't know, the 17th century, the late 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, in a classical political and economical sense, but the great medieval civilization, the 13th to 14th century, had actually already been a moment of major expansion. And after the crisis of the later Middle Ages, Europe had not yet recovered to a greater extent such monetary and market, say, dynamic reality compared to before. The 16th century changes this. The system demographically also comes back, say, it surpasses what has been before. It is different. It is founded at this point on a specific, what we call ancien regime, hierarchy and political control. So such changes in the economical system bring to a significant shattering of some previous orders that I don't know, we started also a series on the English Civil War, for example. There are a lot of points of inspiration as far as that is concerned. Think about the ship money and so on. This is important because there were also anti-traditional features in this dynamic. The world was sort of modernizing, secularizing, and this great economical development was overseen by mostly the third estate, the bourgeoisie, and other commercially involved elements eager to pursue greater profits from trade, industry, and agriculture. Here we're still talking at a broader European level, which, as you know, changes properly the face of society. Like the Western European countries narrowly meant the ones that have say a more progressed statal structure, like France, England, Spain, etc., are the ones that, to an important extent, pursue these goals. There is the newly born Dutch power of the United Provinces that is at least struggling still for independence, but that in that peripheral and autonomous, later independent reality, it's important because it would be the first state to properly secede from the Holy Roman Empire, will, as you know, take off to incarnate, if you want, properly the peak of this new thinking and lifestyle. Central Europe was really different at so many levels. In fact, you can argue still today that while the Netherlands emerged historically from the German kingdom, their culture is not considered Central European, at least more than it can be said for probably the German hinterland, and also in fact going southeast, our Habsburgic focus here. International relations, for this very example we mentioned, the English Civil War, the 80 Years' War, the same 30 Years' War, would undergo a significant transformation, in part because of the sudden rise of the new Habsburgic Empire that still controlled actually with Spain at large the majority of this traffics actually, and the almost continuous wars waged against it by its many adversaries. And when we look at the Austrian Habsburgic side, but not only, of course, we're looking at France and the Ottoman Empire, that, as we have had the opportunity of observing, especially in our series about the 1683 siege of Vienna, were really putting the Austrian Habsburgs, in fact, in the center of an incredibly wide array of, political, ethnic, cultural, religious tensions. We've seen how the Habsburgic dominion itself straddled Germany, Hungary, encompassed Bohemia. It reached the Balkans. France was this mastodontic, really leviathan that had managed to consolidate the most stable statal power in Western Europe, that between a crisis and another had essentially an hegemonic ambition, often at the detriment, in fact, of properly the empire. And on the other side, you had the Turks. You have, at least from both the Habsburgs, are more in direct contact with this still partly Central European and Balkan reality that they had to navigate themselves into, with very different parameters existing there compared to the Austrian world, and mostly, probably the Central European, also the most Germanized one within. In certain cases, think about Transylvania, within the Ottoman Empire, its vassals. The pressure to maintain an ongoing arms race fundamentally altered the domestic policies. Such tensions would naturally keep a pressure to maintain an ongoing arms race that would fundamentally alter domestic policy for everyone involved. politics was essentially turning into a struggle between rulers and their subjects over the power to impose taxes, domestically speaking, which is a bit like the hallmark, right, of political, juridical, institutional history and culture in the early modern era, right? The establishment of a more concentrated power through bureaucratic, administrative, tax collection capacities aimed essentially at providing an effective army for the defense of the same communities. Right? This would take, in fact, a very long time. It was something actually starting since ever, like you can say the Middle Ages, at least in the way normally modernists understand some fundamentals of the same. Then a degree of power concentration exists in every community, otherwise this would probably not be. The important, however, is that such arms race was becoming ever more internationally systemic. For example, at the end of the 30 Years' War, you see the Ottomans purchasing from the Christians, Protestants, and Catholics, or especially the latter alike, a large amount of arms and armor and ammo that had literally been overproduced, and some of this would be used against the same Habsburgs at a point, showing also how dependent the Ottomans were on Western military technology, advisors, etc. Montecuccoli, after the Battle of St. Gotthard, examining the gunpowder found in the barrels of the Ottoman camp's arsenal, said that their powder was excellent, right? And that was until essentially from the introduction of powder granulation was at least mostly affirmed in a systemic way by the Ottomans first at the end of the Middle Ages, and to the bayonet, is the first indicator of firearms technology capability. So showing also in that case that the myth, for example, of a Turk that would continuously just decline since the time of Suleiman the Magnificent is not entirely true. At least we're talking about powers that were capable of standing on their feet and that were definitely dangerous, as the events of St. Gotthard and also Vienna 1683 were proving. The requirements for security prompted the monarchs to emphasize a certain degree of political uniformity that, as we will see better in another video, entailed also stronger religious cohesion among their subjects, as any confessional divide within Christendom could simply be used politically to oppose such authority demands. There was also fear, of course, that the spread of heresy could ignite rebellion or civil war just because, right? And as you know, the 30 Years' War would be fought largely over this. By the early decades of the 17th century, the Austrian Habsburg monarchy thus faced such formidable challenges that, if you want, Christendom had been preparing for an entire century. As you know, the Habsburgs had already tried up to essentially the mid-16th century to hegemonize Germany, Catholically speaking, failing in the enterprise. They had to stop because of the enormous effort, and all these resources being pumped into the system with its imbalance and unpredictability were also spent for, of course, armaments, and this great conflagration of the 30 Years' War is importantly a legacy of the unsettled business of the previous century. That would paradoxically also make that confessional say, conflict being at least surpassed by even more pungent elements for how the power of political and territorial realities was being consolidated in a largely post-traditional system. This is very interesting for the Habsburgs because, say, the interest for them is in pop culture, at least mostly for the 18th, the 19th century, even the 20th when it gets all more interesting. I personally discovered that for most Europeans, sadly enough, there is this saying that the Americans they're such a young country that do not know history, but that's another cliche, for example. But Europeans themselves at large, just look at the history of their own country in the last 200-300 years. They don't properly, because this is not much a matter of, it is also a matter of nationalism and and socialism to an extent, because the two things went in parallel, but it is truly a sort of artificial defocusing from the previous traditional establishment, and so the one from which those same countries came from and had been actually existing for quite a long time. And so when you look at the Habsburgs, they are just, the Austrian guys, right, in a very simplified sense, whereas they were actually, until the 19th century, proper Holy Roman emperors, and trying to manage this massive universal legacy of meaning, of values, and of mentality. And that's the thing that down to the last of the subjects gets somehow very ignored, from the more developed to the less developed parts of the Habsburgic dominion. As you know, part of my ancestry comes from that, and I also had to find out essentially how these people lived it, how important was it for them, and not just, again, in the sort of more populistic, average peasant sort of Central Europe would live like, in this sort of romanticized and also oddly post-traditional versions, loaded in nationalism and or socialism at the same time. But from actually the very elite standpoint, right, of the Holy Roman Empire as an actual power and institution. So as they were entering the 17th century, the Habsburgs were recognizing the necessity of exerting greater control over taxation. This was the greater deal. Essentially, they would proceed like most rulers, but their case would be some of the most mitigated and, in fact, attentive, as you know, to local autonomies. And not just because they cared too much about that, because they were essentially to cope with them anyway, given the very particular nature of their dominion, through the essentially exemption from billeting of the local communities in exchange for the subsidies for maintaining the army, establishing barracks, etc. This would actually fully take shape in the age of Maria Theresia, so it's that late. Also, the Hohenzollern in Prussia basically arrived that late. So it's that Central European war that sort of grows more slowly, but that also produces these veritable powers in European history. And as always, when there is money to pay, the main issue is determining who has to bear such burden. Regardless of the direction the Habsburgs chose, the monarchy itself had essentially the resources to engage actively on the international stage already, which in turn influenced the way they would pursue, in fact, also the domestic policy regarding taxation. In the last video made on this topic, that the Habsburgs were tendentially keeping themselves out of most, say, confrontations, both thanks to the sort of blurred nature of their frontier that, however, they had to control, not being infiltrated by external neighbors who would routinely try to do so. Being in this Central European space, not really challenged by any major power in the at least regional vicinity. I mean, at least Constantinople was pretty far, then Vienna was probably the last, say, the most stretched limit they could reach, indeed, and with enormous effort, in which like almost the entire empire was at stake, and how, in fact, this sort of almost medieval fairy tale world of Central Europe was so, in some ways, backwards, politically, institutionally, statally, that there wasn't too much that the monarchy in itself could demand from the communities. Simply, they lacked the tools, the power concentrations, the means to do so. And especially in the second half of the 16th century, the Habsburgs had a sort of little crisis. There was also yet another split of the dynasty that was risking to compromise such power concentration, a bit as it had happened in the late 14th, the beginning of the 15th century. And so now they had to regain ground. And doing so, actually, in a successful way, as we will see, in spite of all difficulties and what was going on in a bigger picture. In fact, it is accurate to say that the Habsburgic dominions lacked the commercial and manufacturing infrastructure of maritime powers like England or the Netherlands. But even more, they didn't even possess, for example, the well-rounded economy of France. They were not economically backward compared to the rest of the continent either, but hell, regardless of overall power, in World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was militarily the most technologically backwards country in Europe. Really, without much of innovation, of course, there was not much of a difference that it made. In World War I, you can imagine in the 16th or the 17th century. But there is no doubt either that while not economically backward, especially at this time in history, this world was not the best prepared, the best suited for any sudden economic, financially, commercial outbreak that could help building up a particularly centralized system, right? That's why we spent a lot of time observing video after video also how composite the Habsburgic dominions were already at this time. And looking at the economic fundamentals of the various chunks, the Bohemian lands provided a populous and productive manufacturing hub, enhanced by textile and iron industries in Upper Austria and Styria. Plus, the Habsburgs benefited from a strong agricultural foundation. This was particularly true in Silesia, that was part of the Bohemian crown and laying actually in a very decentralized, autonomous way, also politically speaking, in the northeast of that. And Poland, Russia, during the 16th to 17th century had, but since actually, especially Poland after the 14th century crisis, had this massive agricultural output and also wood exports, accomplished the fact that apparently for some reason the country had been spared for the Black Death, so they had lots of, also that the country was actually even more backward, as you know, and then the Habsburgic world, but it had a massive amount of labor. It was strongly populated. The two archduchies and a portion of the Hungarian plain also were particularly productive, agriculturally speaking. As we'll see better now, the Hungarians were particularly exploiting at this point this a bit in the same way, like this was even a failed state, right? But a bit like Poland, economically wise, they had, say, lots of labor. They had this vast plains, agricultural plains, and so it was relatively easier to invest, even with small resources, to produce substantial amount of harvest. In addition, you have the mountainous regions of Tyrol, Inner Austria, Bohemia, and Upper Hungary, positioning the Habsburgs as one of Europe's leading producers of several key minerals. This is particularly relevant because these areas were that productive since Roman times and before. And while it is true that the regional economies tended to operate independently, because they were essentially a byproduct of the local communities, were distinct countries under such dynastic collection of the Habsburgic house. They provided altogether, and they're looking at their interconnection. I talk a bit about the economy of these countries a bit more in depth, the videos on them in the Habsburgic series. They served as a sort of more functional glue. They were sort of more homogeneous and tied together economically than they were politically, administratively, or even culturally. I mean, these were different people speaking different languages, even from different branches of the Indo-European ones. Yet they essentially had developed, thanks to the Habsburgic rule, that was cohesively keeping them safe to an extent, developed internal bonds with one another, with some capacity of responding to the international market demands. Nevertheless, when you look at the early 17th century, you realize that things were not going particularly well from an economical point of view, in particular for the Habsburgs. Because in spite of the Habsburgic centrality in Europe geographically, of course, some of the most important trade routes had essentially detached themselves from the same European heartland. The expansion of overseas commerce, in particular, had significantly reduced European reliance on overland trade. The great Atlantic routes, the ones with America, but also with the same east, the circumnavigation of Africa, had gradually, of course, eroded the same centrality, especially of the European continental economy. Originally, the great engine of the old world had been Italy. We've made lots of videos on this throughout of the entire high and late Middle Ages. And this revolved, of course, around the Mediterranean. There weren't fundamentally other routes for circumnavigating Africa, or so the Silk Route, the main traffics connecting Europe with China, passed through the Mediterranean. With the shift of the focus towards the Atlantic shipping lanes, you have a very important change, because the routes connecting, for example, Italy with Austria and Bohemia through Tyrol, through the Alpine passes, were still important. It would remain so always till to this day for intercontinental trade, but they were, of course, not so important as before. And so in relative terms, this meant that there were other powers in Europe that were gaining the upper hand economically over this historical center. Some of these lands would not be really surpassed until the late 17th century. That's, for example, when England and the Netherlands surpassed Italy in terms of per capita wealth, that had remained uninterruptedly the highest in the world since Roman times. What you see from an Habsburgic perspective in particular is not much the lack of interest for this connection. In the early 18th century, where the Spanish succession, of course, Austria gets her chunk of the Italic kingdom. Lombardy would remain, for example, the most advanced land in the entire Habsburgic Empire, more than Austria, of course, till the end. But the main problem here was not even the Ottomans, because the Ottomans were suffering as much as the Italians, for example. As actually with Venice, they were trying to keep trading between a war and another, exactly to surpass the Portuguese and the Dutch that were going towards the east in this through the circumnavigation of Africa. The main problem, if anything, was more civilizational consequence, and regarding France, right? The increasing capacity of France, as it would be even, especially during the 30 Years' War, to infiltrate Germany and to try continuously also with Louis XIV, that also magnifies this and obliges half of Europe to coalesce against this now, again, renewedly hegemonic threat. The same Germany, right? There are Protestants that prefer the French to the Habsburgs in terms of rule, that actually are perfectly fine with Austria losing to the Turks rather than, having to respond to any emperor in that regard. So pretty messed up stories, but definitely you have this French giant that, as you know, also colonially speaking, is not as performing as England or the Netherlands or Spain or Portugal for that matter at this point in history, but that is, however, a very modern, at least it's really modernizing at a much faster pace than Central Europe, and it is such a shockingly and traumatically large landmass and agriculturally productive country that it can really start using much more, structured, systemic tools to aggress, in fact, the same Habsburgic hegemony in Europe alone. And especially the German lands are the soft underbelly of that. The Habsburgs are dramatically dissented from that in the southeast, and so France has a vast frontier to expand into without Vienna really doing too much about it. Additionally, the influx of silver and gold from the Americas was negatively influencing specifically the Habsburgic mining economy that, as we've seen, had an important relevance since the later Middle Ages. Think about Kutna-Hora, think about the great, the same Austrian iron mines that were used for the Calibus Noricum since again the Romano-Celtic times, access a vast amount, not just of precious metals as we just observed, but lots of resources in a relatively easier way, at least if you cross out, of course, the costs of the competition that existed overseas between Europeans from, in fact, unprecedentedly large pools of such resources, so altering dramatically what was the political and economical balance of the old world. You have also, however, other countries within the same Europe that are rising a bit as a novelty. For example, there is an increase in the copper and iron extraction from Scandinavia that further compounds such challenges. I mean, that the great Swedish opponent of the Catholic cause in Germany during the 30 Years' War has not received, and that's actually most of the reason, an enormous amount of money from the French to equip an army, but greatly this forces were paid through the iron exports that later would be so crucial also for example, for the same Industrial Revolution in England, right? The Swedish iron mines are still, an important thing in European industry, exactly from those times. Sometimes, in fact, relatively modest powers at this point. Sweden is really not what would become through the reforms of Gustavus Adolphus and his entourage, but it's still yet another player, a Protestant one, by the way, that surfaces in an unprecedented fashion also on the international market. At the same time, Habsburgic Hungary, that was also the more developed part of the broader country, was suffering devastating losses due to the wars and relentless border raids that followed the Ottoman invasions and or disturbances. This is really typical. Hungary had really collapsed as a state historically since the Turkish conquest, and it's really easy, like even with a few resources invested as raiders, like local, exploiting the local political, also confessional factionalism at a point, to destroy the enemy harvests, to turn this frontier into a militarized world that is not really suited, in spite of the fertility of the land for long-term agriculture. And so actually causing a massive systemic damage to this other very important part of the Habsburgic domains. During the 15 Years' War that we will see at some point between 1593 and 1606, the Hungarian population, livestock, and crops were particularly shattered. The Ottomans were at a point just bringing massive amount of horse raiders from their Crimean and Volga allies to just loot and deport and destroy. We're talking sometimes 100,000 forces that the Ottomans didn't even control, but they were simply given green light to lay waste all around. I made a video about the strength of the Ottoman armies during this period, and I explained how that was also functional logistically, because in a way those were foragers as well. And we're talking probably thousands of particularly, otherworldly Mongol, literal Mongol warriors brought from God knows where, still at the gates of Germany, of Austria. So that's how traumatically, violently, and impactingly, traumatically brutal this frontier really becomes. And of course you can't expect from there many good things to come, including, say, economical benefits. Furthermore, it's not just royal Hungary under the Habsburgs that is suffering. The Turks push further. They do manage to attack Austria, Moravia, Silesia even. They had a wide range. They were fighting in general also against the Poles. That another actually viable option in 1683 was, other than Vienna, was actually Warsaw, following the Vistula, not the Danubian Valley. So there were forces at play that could simply shatter, they wouldn't be so necessarily always, at least, so threatening for the broader, the immediate stability of the Habsburgic dominions, but definitely they were a constant cost, burdening the empire in a broader sense, because the Ottomans were also fighting against the Venetians. We will see now also the Balkan frontier the Habsburgs controlled. There was a massive effort to try to stamp this giant could simply infiltrate through these lands that were themselves a bit wild, and so even favoring such incursions, paradoxically. Just think economically about this. They are very beautiful to see when you travel across Central Europe, but the famous Türkenglocken, that is to say probably the bell towers of Central European towns, were a product of this cost, because they were erected specifically to warn of as the name says, the approach of the Ottomans. And while, again, a beautiful feature of this country's skylines to be appreciated today, they actually reflected pretty dire times. One of the most detrimental developments in European economical issues, as we were saying before, was the so-called price crisis. In the short term, inflation resulted in significant profit increasing from exporting agricultural and other commodities to Central and Western Europe. And throughout the Habsburgic lands, noble landowners sought to tap into this market by boosting the production of various export goods. And this had, as we were hinting at before, particular consequences in Hungary, because in spite of the sparsely populated area, the landowners' power, the Hungarian oligarchy was notoriously strong. This is why, in part, that the country had the state had failed historically. And so they had the coercive capacity to mobilize enough labor for increasing en masse, right, the production of grain, wine, livestock. I made some videos about medieval Hungary explaining how this was actually a policy, an economical policy since, in fact, those centuries before, because again, there was nothing particularly, again, technological or sophisticated or, you know, robust middle estate of freedom or whatever with some, I don't know, intellectual, political, juridical, entrepreneurial mentality. Hungary, together with Scotland, is one of those countries that actually disproves the idea of Calvinist ethics having much to do with such success. But it was possible with such investment, considering the demand on the market, to produce this pretty large amount of sometimes properly raw material, not particularly worked one, etc., that could still contribute to the income. By the mid-16th century, Royal Hungary's herdsmen were driving an average of 50,000 livestock westward each year, sometimes even 100,000. However, as we've just observed, all this was happening, essentially subtracting labor from manufacturing. And so actually rendering Hungary ever less competitive in a more structural sense. And one of the most direct consequences of this was Royal Hungary becoming wholly reliant on imported finished goods that were also increasing just in cost from Western Europe. We're talking, however, and this is the level of development of the country, like that even the most basic textiles were not to be found, had to be imported, right? Copper products as well, in spite of the fact that, as we just said before, copper was mined in Upper Hungary. The whole economic circuit was so deteriorated that sometimes these copper imports to Hungary were just the result of the same Hungarian copper exported elsewhere in the West, being refined and crafted there and re-imported in Hungary with an additional cost that definitely wasn't really beneficial for the country and for the Habsburgic monarchy. Ultimately, the country paid a steep price for such over-reliance on food production when a downturn in the Middle European economy during the early decades of the 17th century led, as it happened increasingly, as you know, the sort of Malthusian, so-called Malthusian cycle, that is what we call by that, with all the criticism attached, to a 50% decline in grain and livestock prices, right? The system becomes ever more dependent internationally, which in turn exposes it to this systemic failures at some point of the market, to major harvests in some of the most productive the agriculturally productive countries, or some wars to block imports or exports and whatever. And so you have an increasing number of crises that are ever larger, more devastating for the local communities, that are ever less resistant to the international market upheavals. The most serious consequences of this bring the Hungarian noble entrepreneurs to impoverish themselves in the long run, rather than actually making easy money as they thought at the beginning. You have, however, the peasantry, predictably, and the townspeople throughout the entire monarchy to suffer of this, right? Also, Hungary had some important towns. Some of these areas are also today's Slovakia, for example, and so there were German communities. There was a history of urbanization. Of course, nothing dramatic, but also for Central European standards, they were something. And given that these were the centers who relied the most on this major economical issues, there was a further crippling of this center's competitivity with the rest of Europe, thus making the Habsburgs ever more aware of this trend. To enhance their income, landowners across the Habsburgic territories tried themselves in the short medium run to maximize productivity. Again, there wasn't too much that could be done after all. Again, the highly crafted manufacturers or proto-industrial capacity were pretty rare in the bigger picture. The system was overwhelmingly agriculture. However, the Holy Roman Imperials, put in this way, part of the Habsburgic domains were better suited to resist such shock. They reacted culturally, civilizationally, in actually finding efficient solutions to improve the management and the administration of the larger estates. And given that many of the elites here were also increasingly tied to the Habsburgic government, this helped consolidating Habsburgic power in these areas. This phenomenon encouraged the experimental cultivation of new crops. This happened with silk in Lower Austria and Moravia, for example. In some parts of Bohemia, noble entrepreneurs even built extensive artificial lakes for the commercial breeding of carp and pike. We can argue that this is not really a major production, so crucial to the imperial economy, but it's still something, right? It puts in motion other activities. We have landowners in Lusatia, Silesia, and Bohemia that are also some of the least fashionably developed parts of the imperial part of the Habsburgic domains, that, however, promote initiatives for peasant households to supplement their incomes by spinning and weaving cloth for export to Germany. Also Austria, again, there is a interdependency, of course, with the same Habsburgic lands. You have also a policy continuing a bit from an ideal Ostsiedlung, coming a bit more from the West this time. That is to say, this settlement and or just like the hosting of German, English, and Dutch middlemen for developing a cottage textile industry that is actually capable to develop further during the 17th century and adding significantly to the Habsburgic production. It wasn't all pink though, let's say. In fact, many aristocrats also increased production in these lands by arbitrarily placing heavier burdens on their peasants to maximize their profit temporarily without caring too much. This is about the overall productivity in the long run. This is also due to the general fact that they were such large estates owners that they could just they knew they could get that amount of extra income without actually investing too much on the longer run, and God knows what would have happened politically. So they were aware of this risk. So everything was balanced in a way, in a mostly latifundium kind of mentality. Those who suffered the most of such impositions were, of course, the unserved peasants, who were typically barred from acquiring or selling their plots or living in the manor without the permission of their noble overlord. So they could simply be squeezed almost at will. Of course, there were peasant rebellions and this kind of issues. That's part of the broader, again, 16th, 17th century European reality, but we'll talk about this. That is important in the general balance of the empire, because we're always borderline to rebel to an extent. This is true during the Ancien regime. We tend to sort of depict in order to emphasize how arbitrarily powerful these Ancien regime rulers really were, to to often forget like all the massive political institutional crises, uprisings, revolts, etc., that were always there to happen in one another, and that were actually damaging overall like a bit the entire system because of the instability of this estates as a whole. And in this quest for higher profits, there was also an attempt from the aristocrats to reduce the amount of land that their serfs farmed for their own benefit, which was allowed. It was an autonomy, so you could, within this large estates, start cultivating some parts outside of the plot that you had to work for the lord. And the aristocrats would instead simultaneously expand their own demand lands, so essentially consolidating their privilege, their income, without anyone, say, socially being able just to maybe profit from it more effectively. Aristocrats also raised the compulsory labor service, known as the robot, that peasants had to perform on such demand lands. It's actually similar to, this is happening actually more during the early modern era than the Middle Ages, right? This was typical of the Ancien regime, but it had gradually, especially in the circumstances, because of these international crises that were putting greater pressure. Actually, you see this cord being strained. This is what would ultimately trigger events like the French Revolution. It was always, again, led from the above, from the Third Estate in that case, but of course it rested on centuries of important pressure and abuse and so on. So it's not really like this system can organically exist even without this internal conflict. This is normal. Civilization actually needs this to an extent. While it is challenging naturally to make generalizations in such systems, you should study like the entirety of the Habsburgic dominions, which is something that I don't think historiographically has been done to the utmost detail for every place, of course. We can, however, reasonably assert that the living conditions were particularly harsh in Hungary. There the robot service increased. Consider that here there were still Hungarian noblemen ruling, so it's not much of a Habsburgic thing of only, right? There are some general Austrian, of course, gains from this, but mostly, as we've seen, these lands have a very strong sense of an identity on their own, and the reason being, especially in this Central European failed monarchies, the oligarchs that have historically retained an enormous privilege since the Middle Ages, that they abuse all regularly at the detriment of the rest of the population. In Hungary, there was something like 1 day per week of such robot service required by the beginning of the 16th century, while, as you know, Hungary was still standing as an independent country. And by the beginning of the 17th century, this had increased to 3 to 6 days, meaning that basically most of your work was just for the Lord, right, and not much for yourself at all. It's a radical increase that, of course, tells us what had happened in between. The Hungarian state had literally collapsed. The Turks had taken over. The liberty of the peasants that was not that great in Hungary to begin with, during the Middle Ages, had further collapsed. The oligarchs had radically extended their control. So, just here we're talking about Royal Hungary, but this was the same on the Ottoman side of the frontier as well. And this is the concept, like people losing. This is what happens when civilizations collapse. People losing personal freedom right away. Peasants in the Bohemian and Carniolan lands, comparatively, not the word that were attached, as you know, seemed to suffer nearly as much from this sort of new feudalism. This is important because, yes, there is some sort of 17th century crisis that can be paralleled to the 14th century one. It's very different, much less impacting in depth, and especially, and also not lasting too much. But there is some sort of general crisis that plunges such societies into a deeper abyss, we can so say, down a very dangerous cliff. And this, of course, witnesses the reinforcement of oligarchic rule. All right, Bohemia and Carniola were not particularly, advanced lands in a broader political, civil sense. So, of course, private forces, oligarchies, were sort of very, very, very influential. As a consequence, these lands would now be largely driven by market forces as a consequence. And so this greater predatory exploitation of the local resources. Again, where the system tries to find shortcuts, it actually causes more damage. It's more civilized areas that truly have more antibodies to resist major crises. This is definitely true for the 14th century one. So every time there is a major crisis, actually it's the places that had already been built before that really had the better means to survive better. There is the sense that at some point civilization collapses and those on the outskirts are just feeling better. No, they are actually the first ones to actually be already in a deteriorated situation to sink further. And the fact that also civilization gets some blows, and those places only later, much later, begin to rise themselves and can maybe compete on the very long run with those previous areas, is something, again, takes a very long time, and it's just not what immediately and so expandably happens in such critical circumstances. Conversely, a few areas of the Habsburgic domains remained largely unaffected by such crisis. This is also interesting. Not every place suffers the same trend, which also, however, does not add too much to the general Habsburgic trend. In fact, we're talking about relatively isolated and free peasantry inhabited lands like Tyrol, Vorarlberg, also some of what were the protected and privileged soldier colonists of the Croatian military border that were really politically and strategically needed by the Habsburgic regime to protect that part, southernmost part of the dominion from the Ottoman incursions. All right, the Serbian front, the Bosnian frontier, etc. And there also the Venetians helped. So it was a very particular situation, and it's not like Croatia was particularly developed either, but they suffered less, as they had also just less constraints in general due to the fact that they were military colonists, right? And Tyrol and Vorarlberg are a bit like into their own alpine frame. They're more isolated. Things do not change too much for them to begin with, but they're not, as we've seen, also so enormously relevant. Tyrol is, it does have important centers indeed, and there things remain stable. That's a plus. That's important. Moreover, you have the exploitative effects of also noble economic policies extending over things like land tenure, labor obligations. For example, many magnates regard their peasants as a sort of captive source of suppliers and consumers, and they might require them to process their crops, the manorial mill, brewery, other facilities, to sell all their produce directly to the noblemen themselves, often at a reduced rate. So that's how they lead to an extent, just to begin with, despite regardless of the crisis. This arrangement, by the way, allowed the same noblemen to resell the goods directly to agents for export at prevailing market prices. This naturally means that the noblemen would reinvest partly the wealth into their own lands, however, not in such a way that such gains could be, say, evenly benefit the individual liberties of the population. It was just like be more tied to this lord, and just over time, of course, like modernizing, updating, and so, say, the system would actually develop for the better, positively so, yet still at particular conditions, politically and juridically. For example, a magnate could mandate his peasants to make all purchases in towns and villages within their jurisdiction without allowing them to sell products somewhere that would have been more needed, would have properly benefited the peasants more in that sense. It's a very controlled system. Such commercial imperatives represent thus yet another restriction on the liberty of the monarchy's peasants. They posed an even greater threat to the livelihoods of so-called free towns that historically had boasted such place, probably in the imperial estates. We're talking about the imperial free towns, because the idea was that they were historically not under the local noblemen, as it normally was basically for all the rest of the people, but they would essentially refer only to the emperor. But if these towns, of course, exist because they are markets, they have some important economical capacity and ambition, they still remain choked within this massive nobiliar estates that do not actually divert much wealth to those very centers, and they actually have to compete with the same nobiliar economy without being politically or juridically dependent on them, right? So this is obvious. By the way, the noblemen relied across Europe during the ancien regime on a set of manorial towns, foreign export agents, so sort of internal routes that worked privately on their own, sometimes also on medium, long range, for their own individual prerogative, right? Like the peasants themselves, the aforementioned towns lacked the resources to resist without support from the crown, that had historically established them or recognized their condition exactly to contain nobiliar power. That in Germany, in the north of the Alps, in Central Europe, let's say, had always been the winners of the situation, had always again ruled outside the city gates, bishops or princes alike, right, and without much. There is all the chapter, in fact, of ecclesiastical economy that, as you know, was protected, had immunities, exemptions, and so on. We will see it better in another chapter, especially the one about religion, because confessionally speaking, there were connections in this sense. The Protestant countries were more aggressive regarding the ecclesiastical policy, and they tended to nationalize things much more directly, so breaking much more ties traditionally, spiritually, and so on, but let's say cashing more in that sense, even though actually in Germany the Protestant world was poorer than the Catholic South, so there is also this interesting balance. As we'll see, of course, the Habsburgs during the 30 Years' War were the greatest power in Germany. So, and just the ones that throughout the system, doesn't matter how obsolete to us, right, it really sounds like, was for the first half of the 17th century not this strange, especially for Central European standards. On the contrary, was particularly advanced. And war makes leverage on all this, because the various lords would compete for placing themselves in a condition of exploiting such as this radical changes. For example, shifting trade routes, say exploiting, like, for example, the arms and armor production. The towns in this process fell behind because they could not provide really with the bulk of such production anymore, right? They, as long as the nobility kept them sort of aside. So there was, of course, an aristocratic product that went over to the town markets, and eventually from there was also manufactured, crafted, and so on. But not like that ended, right? But the noblemen would organize themselves in such a way to actually support the Habsburgic military effort through their own means and also their external connections. If you think about Wallenstein, you realize how much he fits that sort of magnate background, how resourceful he could be. So it's not like resources were absent, right? But it was, of course, difficult in that case, for example, for the same Habsburgs to simply control that oligarch on his own, having ambitions that went beyond the same imperial authority. So it reflects well the degree of autonomy, the lack of a central control in all this. There is also a disparity, as we saw in the more political institutional videos, between the various representative assemblies. When we talk about, for example, Lower Austria or Hungary, well, there the free towns, for example, could vote, but their vote counted only for one, right? They weren't further represented in a general sense. In the case of Lower Austria, that's actually the more advanced part of the Habsburgic dominions, but in that case you have mostly Vienna that has started phagocytating like the rest. There aren't too many larger centers. Comparatively, the nobility of Hungary in 1608 received from the crown, that was worn, of course, by the Habsburgs, but as kings of Hungary, the privilege of being represented per capita, contrary to the towns, as we've seen, counted only one. So there were roughly 100 Hungarian magnates, and each of them counted one vote, which, at least in the upper chamber of the kingdom's diet, that system was a bit more complex, but there, of course, the nobility was just hegemonic, to say the least. You understand how, and it's not like the Habsburgs were happy with this. Like, of course, I made so many videos explaining what the situation in Hungary was. The Habsburgs would have liked to reduce this nobility to much lower power and controlling way more directly Hungarian resources, exploiting also the local autonomies to counter the aristocracy, etc. But we can definitely see how at the beginning of the 17th century, aristocracy is still fully in control of the system. Actually, it's strengthening its prerogatives exactly because of the external threats and the economic crisis that really does not really present with too many opportunities, too many options, let's say, to begin with, of reform. Of course, there is a resistance just to maintain someone's prerogatives that are sanctioned by, let's say, legitimized by the system, but that really does not find any also other, say, alternative historically, politically, and culturally to this at the moment, right? Things would develop much more gradually over time, starting from the same nobility, starting from, of course, those estates that were also free. There were, free people. There were merchants. There were, saying, towns that did count. In many circumstances, there was, of course, a general traffic, a general sense of reform, and an effort, as we will see, to increase taxation, etc. However, there is also no doubt that the immediate reaction to this crisis was mostly increasing taxation on the free towns and the free peasants, and this overall was not like the solution per se either, right? It was just what allowed, of course, much needed stability at the moment, but of course necessitated of other means to expand the system on its own, which is something we will see in another video. Of course, we'll start talking more about the Habsburgs, as you've noticed, but you have also to enter properly the specifics of the more strictly political and military events, because without this you can't quite find the the real, here it's a bit of a systemic take, but there is of course a lot that can be followed only evenementally, and that without also this other side of the story does not make too much sense. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.